On the first morning of the year 2000, 100 people climbed into a freezing Scottish valley. They were carrying tiny saplings into a place that looked incapable of holding a forest. The slopes were bare. The wind had a clean run from ridge to stream. There was no shelter, no canopy, no sense that anything tall had lived there in a very long time. And yet those volunteers were not starting something new. They were waking something old. They were planting the first trees in Carrifran Wildwood. On the exact day the land changed hands, in a valley bought not by government, not by a billionaire, but by ordinary donors who believed the dead landscape might still remember how to be alive. There was one reason they believed it. In the middle of all that emptiness, one rowan had survived. Just one. The fund-reading slogan built around it sounded reckless. Where one tree survives, 1,000,000 trees will grow. It could have been naive. It could have been romantic. But what happened next turned that line into one of the boldest ecological experiments in modern Britain. To understand why removing sheep could change an entire valley, you have to go back thousands of years, not decades. Carrifran was never meant to be a treeless pasture. Pollen recovered from the peat shows it once held a rich mosaic of woodland. Birch, rowan, hazel, willow, alder, oak, they all belonged here. Then there was the bow, a youth flat bow dated to roughly 4000 BC, the oldest bow ever found in Britain. Somebody made a hunting weapon out of you. In a landscape where today you can barely find a single tree, that bow is a message from the past. This place was once a forest. What broke the system was not one catastrophe. It was repetition, burning, cutting, then centuries of grazing that locked the valley into a permanent stall. This is the part many people miss. Landscapes do not have to be paved over to be functionally dead. Carrifran still looked green. Water still ran through it. Plants still grew. But the process that creates woodland had been interrupted so completely that every new tree was eaten before it could grow into a forest. Sheep and feral goats were not just using the valley, they were freezing it in time. And here is what nobody expected. The surviving rowan was probably not an ancient relic. Official records describe the survivor as only around 70 to 100 years old. That means the land had not lost the ability to grow trees. It had simply lost permission. The one rowan lived because it stood where grazers could not reach. That changed everything. Carrifran was not a place where forest could not exist. It was a place where forest was not being allowed to begin. The decision began with a single question. In the early 1990s, from biologists Philip and Myrtle Ashmore, what if local people could buy an entire upland catchment and restore it from top to bottom toward the ecological condition it had before settled agriculture remade the hills? The idea was first shared publicly in November 1993. A Wildwood group formed in 1995. They searched site after site. Eventually, they fixed on Carrifran because it was the entire valley. 650 hectares, ecologically degraded, but still legible, with historical evidence in the pollen and the bough to guide the work. That should have been the end. A good idea. No money, no land, no chance. Instead, the group launched what was essentially pre-digital crowdfunding. About £400,000 was raised in 2 years. 4/5 came from private individuals. 1/5 came from charitable trusts. No public money was used to buy the land. 600 people gave enough to become founders of the Wildwood. On January 1st, 2000, Borders Forest Trust took ownership, and the first planting began immediately. But the truly radical decision was not to plant trees. It was to remove the things preventing trees from becoming a forest. The plan laid out phased sheep removal from 2000 to 2005, removal of feral goats, construction of a perimeter stock fence. Deer were harder. Fencing them out was judged impractical and visually damaging. So the project chose long-term deer control by shooting. Even from day one, the plan accepted trade-offs. Archaeological sites would be left unplanted with buffers. Around 1/5 of the area would remain open ground. Some habitats mattered precisely because they were not woodland. Restoration, from the very start, was never as simple as plant every inch. Once the grazing pressure loosened, the valley started answering back. Since that first day in 2000, around 750,000 trees and shrubs have been planted at Carrifran. Most went in below 500 meters, but significant planting pushed up around 700 meters. Rebuilding not just woodland, but treeland woodland and montane scrub, habitats that had nearly vanished from southern Scotland. The species mix was deliberate: 56% downy birch, 14% sessile oak, 10% rowan, the rest a careful blend of alder, ash, aspen, willow, wych elm, holly, bird cherry, hazel, sourced as locally as possible. Monitoring showed overall mortality stayed below 10%. But here is where the story becomes strange. Some of the most dramatic changes were not in the planted trees at all. Once sheep and goats were gone, the unplanted ground began reorganizing itself. Tall herb communities erupted in summer. Plants trapped on inaccessible cliffs, sea campion, mountain sorrel, roseroot, began appearing lower down, on river gravel islands, where seeds had probably been arriving for centuries, but had never been allowed to establish. Blanket bog started to recover. Heather, cotton grass, sphagnum, reclaimed bare peat. On the summits, rare mossheath advanced. The valley was not just growing wood, it was regaining vertical complexity, moisture retention, shade, litter, cover. All the quiet infrastructure and ecosystem needs to surprise you. Scientists thought they understood the timeline. They were wrong. The clearest evidence came from birds, because Carrifran had something restoration projects almost never get: a near-perfect comparison valley. Right next door sat Black Hope. Same topography, still grazed, still unplanted. Surveys began before restoration and continued through both valleys. At Carrifran, only 2 woodland species, willow warbler and chaffinch, appeared until 2008. Then the trees crossed the threshold. Blackcap, lesser redpoll, dunnock, garden warbler, siskin, robin, blackbird, tree pipit, woodcock, song thrush. The number of woodland birds rose from 4 individuals in 2007 to 262 in 2015. Black Hope did not show the same change. It stayed a grazed upland bird community, and birds were only part of it. Moth trapping in 2003 found 68 species, with only 5 typical woodland moths. Later trapping recorded 159 species, with woodland species climbing to around 20. Red squirrels turned up from 2012. Possible pine marten sign appeared in 2018. Otters remained occasional visitors. 5 bat species were recorded. What looked like tree planting was really the rebuilding of habitat layers that other life could finally plug into. But this is not a clean redemption story. It never was. The same surveys that recorded woodland birds arriving also recorded open country species retreating. The meadow pipit, once dominant, fell from 79% of all birds counted to 34% by 2015. Wheat ears became scarcer as rougher grass and developing woodland changed the ground. Blackcock still leg high on the site, but black grouse numbers, like elsewhere in the borders, have declined. Restoration succeeded, and in succeeding, it made some species less a home. That is the complication at the center of Carrifran. Some open upland habitats are not empty wasteland. They are internationally important in their own right. The original plan worried that of grazing simply vanished everywhere. Certain mire communities, grassland fungi, shortwood specialists could disappear. So the project deliberately kept substantial open ground, protected archaeological sites from planting, and avoided turning the valley into a uniform blanket of trees. Restoring wilderness required design, restraint, and constant argument about what kind of wildness actually belonged there, and the management never stopped. Sheep still occasionally get in. When the boundary fence is damaged or buried in snow, roe deer browse oak, ash, aspen, rowan, And since 2015, about 25 roe deer a year have been shot to keep damage acceptable. Ash dieback is now visible in established trees. The project's own FAQ admits this is not turning the clock back. It is creating an ecosystem that functions more like the old one, under modern conditions, with modern diseases, modern fragmentation, and missing predators. That may be the deepest lesson of Carrifran. Ecological restoration is not nostalgia. It is negotiation. The planners used 6,000-year-old woodland as a reference, not a fantasy of perfect rewild. They chose not to preload the valley with southern species in anticipation of climate change. They accepted that some plants with poor dispersal might eventually need human help. They acknowledged that absent predators, especially the long-lost ones, leave herbivore pressure as a permanent human responsibility. Even the project prefers the term ecological restoration over rewilding because the latter carries too much baggage. This is not a fairy tale about stepping back and letting nature do everything. It is about removing the main blockade, then staying humble enough to keep learning. And that lone rowan still explains the philosophy better than any policy document. The point was never the humans could manufacture an ancient forest from scratch. The point was that the valley still held memory. Once the pressure lifted, birds carried seeds, shrubs spread, bogs healed, cliffs exported plants into the valley floor, and planted trees became parents rather than products. Carrifran was not rebuilt in the way a building is rebuilt. It was released. A quarter century after planning began. The project is still unfinished by design. Borders Forest Trust says planting will continue for a long time, but increasingly in a targeted way, focused on absent and underrepresented species, rather than sheer quantity. Peatland repair is continuing. The damaged bog in Rotten Bottom is healing naturally, and additional peat hag restoration has expanded across the wider landscape work. Carrifran is no longer a lonely experiment. It is the first piece of a broader wild heart in southern Scotland. That wider project now spans about 31 square kilometers of land under restoration at adjoining Tala and Gameshope. Acquired in 2013, more than 220,000 trees and shrubs have already been planted. Sheep were removed in 2014, and natural regeneration has begun. Aspen suckers, river willows, rowans spreading from remnant outcrops. 30 hectares of montane scrub now cross the boundary
between the two sites,
creating the beginnings of something much larger than one rescued valley, a connected upland restoration zone in a part of Scotland long defined by loss. There is one more layer to the transformation. The South of Scotland Golden Eagle Project says translocations between 2019 and 2025 helped reinforce the southern population to nearly 50 birds, more than have been recorded in the area for over 300 years. Carrifran's own records note that golden eagle sightings should increase as that work continues. So the valley that began with one inaccessible rowan is now part of a recovering southern upland system, big enough to matter to an apex raptor again. That is not just woodland restoration. That is scale returning to a landscape that had been reduced for centuries. Today, the survivor rowan no longer stands alone. The tree that once looked like an exception now looks like a prophecy. Around it, the valley is filling with the descendants of an idea that sounded almost absurd when it began. Buy the whole place, remove the sheep, and trust that a damaged ecosystem is not always a dead one. The miracle was not that people planted trees in a Scottish valley. People do that all the time. The miracle was that they identified the real blockage, had the nerve to remove it, and then waited long enough to watch an entire landscape change its mind. And Carrifran was not the only time a single environmental decision unlocked a hidden system. In the next transformation story, the same pattern appears somewhere completely different. One intervention, one release, and an ecosystem humans thought they understood.